So my name's Lisa Denning. I'm a research fellow in the Politics and Governance program here at ODI. For those of you, I did promise in the last seminar that it was my last seminar, and I just happened to be back briefly, so I really won't be here for the next one. But this is the 6th seminar in the Security and Justice Seminar Series, funded by Atos, COFFEE, GRM, KPMG, the Law and Development Partnership, and Safer World. And for those who've not attended before, the seminar has been running sort of this financial year. This is the 6th of 7 seminars we'll end up having. And the idea was to sort of create a forum where a lot of people working on different aspects of security and justice from across government, research, implementers, NGOs, private sector, etc., could come together to kind of talk about some of the pertinent issues we face in security and justice work. We've also sort of tried to encourage these forums to be as informal as possible. So while we record the presentations, we don't record any of the discussion. The discussion is all under Chatham House rules, off the record, to sort of try and encourage as much frankness as possible. We'll have a final seminar this year in March, and we'll send out details of that to the mailing list after this seminar. But for this seminar, we're going to introduce the UK Stabilisation Unit's approach to strengthening the security sector in contexts where the capability and legitimacy of political authority is lacking and where politics are turbulent, with persistent political violence and weak institutional capacity. So Dr. Ben Lovelock, who is the principal author of the Stabilisation Unit's Security Sector Stabilisation Approach, will present the approach before Freddie Carver will provide some comments in response, exploring some of the practical implications and the challenges of making SSS a reality. So just to give some background on the speakers, Ben Lovelock is a former Royal Marines officer whose interest is in the political security dimension of contemporary peace and stability operations. He's had wide exposure to conflict environments in the Balkans, Iraq, the occupied Palestinian territories, and is a senior security and justice advisor with the Stabilisation Unit. Freddie Carver is the head of the Security and Justice Group at the Stabilisation Unit and has spent much of the last decade working as a conflict and governance advisor with DFID. He's worked in the former Soviet Union, Latin America and Asia, but spent most time on sub-Saharan Africa, in particular South Sudan. So the two presentations will last for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for wider discussion. So that's a chance to sort of ask questions, but also very much to get your own reflections and to have a bit of a wider discussion. Two very quick housekeeping points. The toilets, for anyone looking for them, are back towards reception, the last door on the left. And if there's a fire alarm, we all have to exit back through the front doors through which you came. There's also a drinks reception after the seminar, and please feel free to stay along and join us for that afterwards. So Ben, I'll hand over to you.
Right, thank you. Good evening. It's great to be here. What I'd like to do is share some of the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years, capturing one aspect that we reckon is pretty fundamental to the early stabilisation challenge, and to look at how we can use some lessons that we've learned, perhaps some new ideas, in order to adapt and improve our approach in future. We've drawn on a wide range of experiences, some of those a little further back, such as Kosovo and East Timor, but also South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Somalia, DRC, Iraq, Afghanistan, and some topical ones, thinking of Libya, Syria. Now, the key theme that emerges there is that neither a security brackets military or police type approach or political actions on their own are going to get us on a path to some sort of basic stability and getting a political process moving or going or enhanced or whatever. So we need to think about that and how we might improve that situation. I'm very conscious of the expertise in the room here this evening, and I have to say I speak with some humility. I'm more interested in having a conversation than preaching at you, but I've got to say a few words first, as it were, to get this going. So please take it in that spirit. But we're I think both of us very keen to have a conversation and exchange ideas. What I'm going to do is just very quickly lay out a context for security sector stabilisation, talk a little bit about the problems, some of the things we've learned, some basic assumptions underpinning our approach, how we look at the short term and the medium to long term, some really difficult practical challenges and how we can think about planning through that, what we're trying to achieve and transition, and then finally just to very quickly signpost a few questions which to some extent Freddie will pick up, but it would be good to come back to in discussion along with other things. So the context, we're talking about something that is post-conflict, but with pervasive political violence. You are likely to see a proliferation of predatory armed groups, although it might be deceptively calm on the surface. But the potential for political violence is there. There's likely to be minor opportunistic crime, including including people trying to make a livelihood, and looting, all those sorts of things. There's likely to be an absence of a durable political settlement. There's likely to be a poor political process, and with that, poor political development. So that leads us to rather questionable host government or state legitimacy. But as we know, there's no such thing as an ungoverned space, so any vacuum will quickly be filled by competition and or competing forms of political authority. So that leaves us with an environment that is at best semi-permissive or even non-permissive for many of us, for internationals and indeed for some locals alike. It might leave us with a requirement, or a perceived requirement at least, for military engagement, either if you like, on a Western basis, or indeed through others on a more local, regional basis. We're likely to see weak or contested institutions, a lack of trust, or a complete disappearance of the state machinery. And again, you're going to have confusion between different groups who all think that they, both in the formal and informal sectors, who think that they may have a piece of the pie in terms of providing security. So, from a people perspective, who do they place their trust in? Do they go with militias, or do they go with the state? And the state has little interest in them beyond collecting rents. And I guess the question that flows from that, how can we help to protect them from an alternate social order? So in other words, I've basically described pretty much the worst possible scenario, but actually it's one that we're facing on a regular basis in fragile and conflict-affected states. What we have identified in terms of lessons and earlier work in these sorts of scenarios show us that security can't really wait for longer-term security sector reform or security system reform, as termed. We need some degree of security in the short term, but we're not, in practical terms, in a position to build security and justice institutions without some form of political settlement. So the Security Sector Stabilisation Approach really suggests a two-speed effort. Firstly, to stabilise the security situation, and so with that to help open a little bit of political space, whilst at the same time creating conditions for something in the longer term in terms of development. So therefore we need to really look at what are our early stabilisation priorities for dealing with that security situation and how to set the right conditions for the longer term. And setting those conditions is in large measure, as we know, dependent on getting the political process going, which is why I talk about opening the political space for starting to deliver a political solution and resolve conflict issues. So this is a very, very different situation to that envisaged by the theory behind SSR, or indeed security system reform as defined by OECD. And it's basically, in those terms, it is a fundamentally political activity. But we are talking about places where the political will and the local ownership may not exist or the political settlement may not exist for a state to develop that sort of social contract that is implied by that. And so therefore, we've got to think about doing this a slightly different way. So that's what the sort of what we think we've identified in terms of lessons and approaches. Looking ahead to a security sector stabilisation approach, we're really making three assumptions. The first is that the international community, in some form or other, will continue to engage through either doing some of this activity ourselves or advising others, even in the most difficult and non-permissive of stabilisation environments. We assume that this requires some guiding political framework, even if that's contested, and some form of governing authority, possibly an interim one, at a national, international, and even potentially subnational level, depending on how much of the thing we're envisaging biting off. And thirdly, that this activity can only be considered in tandem with political and governance stabilisation activity. And we have to be clear here that the primacy of the political strand in this is absolutely vital, because it's a political objective that we're seeking, and by opening the political space to get the political process, the local political process moving, and we can perhaps come back to the whole question of political processes in discussion. So the intent of the security sector stabilisation approach in the short term is to help, as I've indicated, stabilise the security sector, to provide time and space for that political process. And we do this by addressing both power and conflict together, because these are woven together very much in a nexus of political security actors. So we need to understand, therefore, the links between politics and insecurity. We need to think about how we can make people safer and improve confidence. We need to, therefore, be very clear on how we coordinate our activities in both the political and the security domain together. And again, not really time to go into that in great detail now, but I think we should come back to that in discussion. In the longer term, the point is to help the state to increase its legitimacy. And this brings us back to this intimate linkage with political and governance stabilisation, and provides us with a basis for other stabilisation activities as a bridging activity towards longer term development. Haha, you're saying, well, that's all, that sounds great, but there's a lot of challenges there. Absolutely right. And you know, we have to acknowledge that and address these challenges head on, because we are not suggesting that this is in any way a recipe for an easy transition from chaos to order, but it is an approach that we believe can be used, providing we understand what we're getting into and have a reasonable analysis of the problem. So what are some of those practical challenges? Well, first of all, we've got to think about public security. We've got to think about protecting people, particularly minorities. We've got to think about protecting key infrastructure and institutions. We've got to think about adopting a human security approach, and in terms of improving resilience. So it's both a state security and a human security idea. And if we are talking about designing support for armed groups, at the same time, we should be thinking about designing support for civilian structures and civilian groups, and vice versa. So we've got to think about creating a civil security connection at the point of use. Clearly, we've got to either enable or, at the very least, not interfere with humanitarian activity. We've got to think about working to manage the informal security and justice sector. We've got to reduce the drivers and opportunities for state forces to illegitimately use violence, and therefore, in terms, improve perceptions of legitimacy there. And we've got to look at the incentives and perceptions which promote, enable, or tolerate violence. And I'm thinking about the basic functioning of the justice system, access to justice, and moving away from impunity. In terms of accessing all of this, how do we do it? Well, we can think about bottom-up approaches, we can think about top-down approaches, we can think about both. But if you're operating from the bottom, what do you do in terms of assumptions about what would happen at state level and vice versa? So we have to think very clearly when we are dealing with local groups, if that's the scenario, as to what that actually would connect with in the medium to long term and how that would work. And the essential planning yardstick throughout all of this is to ensure that we respect the primacy of the political process. Therefore, we judge all actions against their impact on that political process. And if we think that something is not going to impact positively on the political process or the peace process, depending on how you want to define it, the question is, well, why are you doing it? So the argument is that we should ensure that all technical efforts ultimately support that overall political progress. Just to add a bit of colour to that briefly, I mean, I've talked about the political security nexus. Why are we worried about that? We're worried about that because that's about power. To reinforce the point, security is political. Who controls the ground controls the power and therefore the resources. And these folk are likely to be resistant to change. So, as we know, we're really talking about a Gordian knot here, and perhaps Libya is an obvious topical example of that. We also have to recognise the differences between power and legitimacy. People might have power, but it's certainly in no way makes them legitimate. And we have to then answer the question of how to engage acceptably in terms of our own rules. I'm thinking of the OSJA, and to accept that by engaging with people, to some extent, we're giving them oxygen, and hence we're sustaining power. So there are therefore difficult choices about, particularly when service delivery security is needed urgently. But what are we leading? Where are we taking this? What are we enabling here? I think, just to highlight, conscious of time marching on, but just to highlight one topical challenge in the DRC. I don't know if anyone here is particularly familiar with the DRC, but if you look at the challenge there that the UN mission MONUSCO is facing, what they need is a comprehensive strategy to deal with the armed groups. And the approach that we're suggesting would suggest that they need military or security pressure to disrupt armed groups and their revenue collection. At the same time, they need to avoid civilian casualties to protect people and to get the DDR process moving. At the same time, they need agreement on judicial treatment of group leaders and police action against follow-on networks. So what I'm trying to do is just paint a picture that, if you apply this thinking to live problems, you can see, I hope you can see, that there is something there that we can talk about. About 2.5 years ago, I was sitting in the Goresk District Community Council in Helmand in Afghanistan. And when you view it from that lens, as I'm sure many of you have, you realise just what a challenge it is to begin to join these things up and to get that sense of beginnings of accountability, beginning to move towards legitimacy. Not easy by any means, but this is what I mean by connecting the security to the assistance we're giving on the security side to the assistance that we're giving on the civilian group side as well. I want to wrap up, but I'd just like to offer a few sort of final thoughts on my talk before Freddie takes it forward. I think it's most important to understand the context and culture before we jump in. But I'd ask the question, can we? Do we? Ever? Really difficult one, that. But there's a really difficult analytical and cultural question there. I think I've said often enough that security sector stabilisation is not the same as SSR, and I really want to emphasise that point. We're not taking a pop at SSR. We're saying this is something rather different, in a different, perhaps earlier phase, and it's much more fluid and challenging in programming terms, and it demands flexible delivery. And I think Freddie will cover that in much more detail. I just emphasise the fact it's all about politics and power and that two-speed approach with desired outcomes of helping them to get the local actors to get their political processes movement, supporting existing peace initiatives and agreements, and to arguably help the improve the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of its citizenry. But as a note of caution there, of course, we ignore the informal sector at our peril, and inevitably we'll come back to difficult dilemmas over service delivery there. A very brief word on transition. We need to plan carefully for transition into something else. It's a political challenge and a practical challenge, and we're very conscious that we need to create a balance between effective service delivery on the one hand and some degree of accountability and obviously sustainability on the other. There's a few, hopefully I've already given you a few things that you might want to come back at, but a few sort of points for discussion that you might like to think about. I mean, how should we, do we make programming relevant to this political process? Can we design that in? Is there a question there? Do we have the right deployable political capabilities in the sense of the ability to help those peace processes move forward at the point of delivery? How do we deal with the inevitable challenges that our embassies in these countries will face when we throw up some pretty tricky suggestions about things that we might do and what short-term and medium-term impacts those might have? In terms of planning, do we understand enough about what I would term the ripeness of political and peace processes for this sort of engagement? Are we good enough at that? And finally, should we be looking at what I'm talking about as a glide path, probably a pretty bumpy glide path, or should we be thinking about a more transformational approach? But can we do that without pretty fundamental consent and a large dollop of power from somewhere, either our own or others, to underpin that, especially when we're working through second or third parties, as we are in places like Somalia? Okay, that's my pitch. I would just say briefly that I think this is on the SU website, isn't
yes,
it?
It
so,
is.
you know, there is an awful lot more there in terms of detail. I've only cantered over the sort of headings, and it frustrates me, as it may frustrate you, that I can't sort of do more. But in the time available, that's what I think it's worth saying just to kick off a discussion.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to try and keep my comments pretty brief, just to kind of get some conversation going, and really just a kind of couple of introductory points. And then what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about, I think, some of the reasons why this is difficult and what the challenges are, and particularly kind of reflecting on a context that I know very well, and I know others in the room know pretty well as well, in terms of South Sudan and how what this might have meant for the way some things have been done over the last few years, and perhaps a little bit on kind of what it might mean going forwards as well. But yeah, a couple of introductory points. I guess on one level, I think it's important to say at the root of what we're saying here is that engaging on security issues requires political engagement. So far, this is something that we've said before. We've all talked about quite a lot. But I think the point that we also all know well is that we aren't set up to do this well. We're not set up to deliver that kind of approach in practice, and that actually there are quite a lot of environments where we work where that really isn't good enough, because the political settlement is so weak, so fragile, because the threat of violence to that political settlement undermines it to such a degree that actually we need to be bringing this together in a much more fundamental way than we are at the moment. So we need to think actually operationally about how we make that work better. I guess the second point is, I think we've agonised at some length about the name, and it's undoubtedly problematic, I think, would be one way of putting it. I think a couple of points I'd make is one, we're very conscious that this isn't just about the security sector. I think there is a useful, which I'll pick up on, a useful conversation to be had about, well, how is this different from security sector reform? And I think we did want to kind of bring that out, but what we're talking about is security issues, much more writ large, and how do you engage with those and how do you respond to those? It's not just about the formal security sector in that sense. And secondly, obviously the word stabilisation carries a set of baggages and a set of issues which aren't always helpful. And I think we certainly want to, and I think why South Sudan is an interesting context. Bringing this out is not traditionally somewhere that's kind of falls or has always fallen into the stabilisation box from the international community's perspective. And I think that's an important point. This is about a wider range of places, and it really is to do with that combination of weak political settlement and high levels of violence, which certainly South Sudan reflects. So I want to focus on kind of three-ish broad areas I think present real challenges in this. And I think that the first one is probably the most important. And it really is that this takes you into very risky and difficult territory. And I think that's probably in a way the most important point, is to say, I think some of what happened with the SSR agenda was to rightly move a set of work with a set of actors into the broader development space, understand the linkages between it, and how that can be brought together in a different way, and how to get a different set of actors involved in that conversation. But I think perhaps one of the unintended consequences was to slightly move it into a technical space, into an area where we're focused on a set of processes which we're more comfortable dealing with, and we can kind of divorce from perhaps the harder end of this. And I think really what we're saying is that actually engaging on security issues in these environments is absolutely at the sharp end, and understanding what's going on with security, engaging with security actors, involves picking winners. It involves dealing with militia forces who may have all sorts of allegiances and histories, and enormous challenges in terms of engaging with them as the British government or as other types of international actors. And we need to be extremely realistic about what it is we're trying to achieve, and we need to tie together the political process at the kind of highest levels with the nuts and bolts and the brutal reality of politics and security on the ground in these environments. And that's not just about capitals as well, where the international community tends to be focused, but also further down in areas where things are going on that are much more obscure, I think, sometimes to some of the international actors. And it will almost certainly involve the use of coercive force. And these are not always comfortable issues to be involved in, but I think if we as international actors are getting involved in these environments, it behoves us to accept that that's what we're doing. And what that means, particularly environments where, that has a set of implications in an environment like Afghanistan or Iraq, where, say, the UK government is coming in that with a strong kind of military engagement, but in an environment like DRC or like South Sudan, or Somalia, as Ben said, where the sets of international security actors involved are different, multiple, working to multiple strands of authority. It creates a whole set of silos which really aren't helpful for having an overall integrated approach to this. And I think the kind of processes we tend to see, the peace process, in my head I have the kind of 2005, 2006, 2007 period in South Sudan, CPA ends, the hard kind of political grafts to get an agreement together to put that in place, then translates into a whole set of processes. There was the JAM, as it was called, the Joint Assessment Mission, which led to the development of the Multi-Donor Trust Fund, a big World Bank UN-led process. Meanwhile, in parallel, a large peacekeeping mission was put together and framed. And meanwhile, the bilateral actors worked out what that might mean, and the development actors started to think about development programming. None of this lends itself well to a fundamental analysis that says, if this agreement's going to stick, we need to hold a set of security issues at the heart of this and work with the political actors who are going to make the difference in an environment like South Sudan to find ways to put this into practice. And the UN peacekeeping force is going to have an important role to play in terms of enforcing that, or in terms of playing that monitoring, that assurance role. And we need to engage in that from day one. And I think that requires a really, and I think, sorry, just to continue that political engagement at the same level. I think that's something that we've traditionally struggled with. We all know the kind of cycles of interest and engagement, and the signing of the peace agreement is seen as, well, we're moving on, and that political engagement tends to drop off sharply. But actually, how do you sustain it, and how do you bring sets of activities and support in behind it that are actually going to enable that interaction, the interaction that Ben was talking about? And have we had the difficult conversations within our own institutions and organisations? Obviously, I'm particularly thinking of the British government here about, well, how much political risk are we willing to take? How much political capital are we willing to keep putting on the line to make this work, and to take these difficult decisions, and to take risks, and to take some of the reputational flak that might come with that? And there's a whole set of, I think, conversations that don't always happen, and we then drift into sets of activities and programs and interventions that fundamentally aren't kind of understanding those links. And again, I think there's a big issue around kind of coordination across the international community. You look at a lot of what was happening between 2005 and 2010 was about the key international players in South Sudan at the time trying to kind of find ways to bring programs together and start doing political messaging in a much more integrated way, picking up on some of what had been lost back in that had been much stronger back in 2005. And I think, again, there's a break that comes there in terms of the way the process happens that is really problematic. There's a set of issues there. And also how to deal with some of the other acts. I mean, this is something I think that in Libya right now is a real issue. Is in a very complex set of negotiations that are happening at multiple levels, internationally and domestically. How do we understand the full range of the conversations that are going on, the deals that are being made, and understand what that means for what we might be seeking to achieve? I think the second point then, which flows very directly from that, is how we make sure we have the right analysis, and that we're able to sustain that over time. What I think implementing this kind of approach requires is a really clear-eyed understanding of what's going on, what the security situation on the ground is really like, and how Ben talked quite a bit about how the key power players are working and are interrelated and are driving that. And I think it's something we, again, as an international community, really struggle to get our head around. If we do get our head around it, it tends to be at a moment in time. And it's something that I think can be very difficult then to communicate. If we're accepting the point I was making around risk and around the need for that kind of strong political engagement, politicians sometimes have a certain view of a situation and don't necessarily want the analysis based on actually what's going on the ground, because there's a narrative or there's a public perception of what's going on, and I think where that kind of crunches up against each other, we see some real disconnects between actually what ends up happening on the ground and in terms of interventions and really what the requirement might be. And I think we need to find better ways to build in analysis, to keep that up to date, to do that not just in, again, I make this point, not just in capitals. And this is something I saw repeatedly in South Sudan, how difficult it was for much of the international community to get out of Juba, to get understanding what was happening at state level and below and how that related to what was happening in Juba. And we know that these, it's not easy. No one should kid ourselves that understanding how security actors operate and are working with each other and so on. It's always going to be very, very difficult to get the full understanding of that. But I think we could probably try harder. And I think we should probably think about different ways of doing it to the ways we do it at the moment, to make sure that analysis is there and also that it's sustained and it's kept up to date on a pretty regular basis, so it can form real-time activity. And that's really the final point, I think, that is also a struggle for this, particularly perhaps for actors on the kind of development side, and when the resources start flowing, is that we go into programming approaches, and we quite quickly move into we need to develop programs that enable us to act and to provide assistance and provide support. And actually, I think the conclusion to some of this is that programming approaches that tend to, and I'm not saying this is always how programming approaches have to work, but I think a lot of the time it does. It creates a box. It says we'll start then, we'll operate for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We have a set of objectives, we have a set of outputs, and we get the train going. Now, we manage the program well. We're in a position where we can I don't want to create a straw man. We can influence it as we go along. But actually, I think what we're saying is that what we need to be doing is working extremely nimbly, very opportunistically, recognizing that things change on a very regular basis, and that we need to be in a position to do that, and that actually large and long-scale commitments might not be appropriate given how volatile the situation is, given how power brokers might change, given how the situation on the ground might change. And finding ways, again, collectively across the international community to set up the kind of platforms that would allow us to do that kind of assistance, provide that kind of support in a way that it can be easily kind of flexed up and down with the way that financial cycles work and all of the. I mean, this is well-worn ground. I'm conscious in terms of some of the challenges of the way that international actors work, but again, I think if we're serious about having the kind of impacts in these environments, we do need to think really hard about how do we set ourselves up to deliver, and can we find slightly different ways of thinking about it. I'll stop there. But again, hopefully that's enough to get some discussion going, and we can pick it up from there. But thanks a lot.